Hey there, and welcome back to your daily dose of what's got the tech world talking. Yesterday, Hacker News served up 29 stories, but 5 of them really captured the community's attention. And honestly, they paint a fascinating picture of where we are in tech right now. We've got everything from World War II code-breaking secrets that'll blow your mind, to modern battles over who really owns that $1,000 phone in your pocket. We're diving into the reality of managing ADHD in tech, exploring a mesmerizing visualization that's got everyone hooked, and wrapping up with a philosophical debate about whether you need to feel your work to make it great. So, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. Story 1. World War II Cryptography. All right, so here's something that'll make you rethink every spy movie you've ever watched. Our first story comes from a fascinating Stack Exchange question about an cryptic instruction that appeared on World War II telegrams. This telegram must be closely paraphrased before being communicated to anyone. Now, when you first hear that, it sounds completely backwards, right? I mean, if you're Churchill sending a critical message to FDR about, say, military movements or strategic plans, why wouldn't you want it quoted exactly? And here's where it gets even weirder. They specifically said closely paraphrased, not loosely summarized, not heavily edited, but closely paraphrased. It's like they wanted the message changed, but not too much. This little mystery sparked 106 comments and over 550 points of engagement on Hacker News. And once you dig into why they did this, it's actually brilliant. See, this wasn't about the content at all. It was about protecting the encryption methods themselves. During World War II, both the Allies and Axis powers were in this constant mouse and cat game with cryptography. The Germans had their Enigma machines, the Lorenz cipher, and the Allies had teams of brilliant codebreakers at places like Bletchley Park trying to crack them. One of the most effective attacks they could use was something called a known plain text attack. Basically, if you know what a message says in plain English and you have the encrypted version, you can start to reverse engineer how the encryption works. Think about it this way. Imagine every telegram from Churchill started with Prime Minister Churchill to President Roosevelt. Boom, that's a pattern. Or if they ended every message with God Save the King or some standard military sign-off. These repeated phrases become like a Rosetta Stone for codebreakers. There's actually this amazing story from the discussion where someone mentioned that Bletchley Park once cracked a message because a lazy German operator sent the exact same long message twice when asked to repeat it. That one mistake gave them enough data to break into the entire Lorenz cipher system. So, by requiring paraphrasing, they were essentially adding another layer of security. Even if someone intercepted both the encrypted message and somehow got access to what was communicated to others, they couldn't directly match them up. It's like an early version of what we now call defense in depth in cybersecurity. What really caught my attention in the discussion was this debate about whether you should delete words or add them when paraphrasing. Big Jono made this really interesting point that contradicts what you might expect. The conventional wisdom was that you should delete rather than expand, but they argued that compression actually limits variation while expansion increases it. Like, if you have a 100-word message and cut it to 50 words, there are only so many ways to do that while keeping the meaning. But if you expand it to 150 words, the possibilities multiply. And then there's this delicious irony that someone pointed out. The instruction itself, this telegram must be closely paraphrased, was standardized. It appeared on telegram after telegram, creating exactly the kind of known plain text that the whole system was designed to prevent. It's like putting a sign on your secret door that says, "Secret door, please ignore." You know what strikes me about this whole thing? We're seeing the exact same tensions play out today with modern encryption. How do you balance security with usability? How do you share sensitive information while protecting the methods you use to secure it? The technology is completely different. We're talking about RSA keys and AES encryption instead of Enigma machines, but the fundamental challenge hasn't changed. There's even this parallel to how we handle encryption today. Think about how companies deal with encrypted communications. They'll often have policies about not forwarding certain emails or requirements to paraphrase sensitive information when sharing it more broadly. It's the same principle. You're not just protecting the information itself, but the entire security infrastructure around it. The discussion also touched on how this connects to the development of early computers. The Colossus machines at Bletchley Park, which were some of the first programmable digital computers, were built specifically to attack these kinds of cipher systems. So, in a weird way, these paraphrasing requirements, this seemingly simple administrative instruction, were part of an arms race that helped drive the development of modern computing. What really gets me is imagining being the person who had to do this paraphrasing. You're handling these world-changing communications between Churchill and Roosevelt, and you have to rewrite them just different enough to be secure, but similar enough to preserve the exact meaning. No pressure, right? One wrong word choice, and you might change the course of history, or accidentally give the enemy a cryptographic advantage. Speaking of control and security, that tension between protection and freedom, it's playing out right now in your pocket in a way that's got the Hacker News community absolutely fired up. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the Hacker News crowd absolutely fired up. Google/your $1,000 phone needs our permission to install apps now. And wow, with nearly 500 comments, this one really struck a nerve. So here's what's happening. Google appears to be tightening the screws on Android app installation, and the community is not having it. The framing here is particularly brutal, right? You drop $1,000 on a flagship phone, and now Google's saying, hold up, you need our permission to install what you want. It's like buying a sports car and then being told you can only drive on pre-approved roads. What's fascinating about the discussion is how quickly it escalated from this specific Android issue to this existential crisis about the future of computing. People are drawing parallels to Cory Doctorow's warnings from over a decade ago about the war on general-purpose computing. Remember when phones were just computers that happened to make calls? Now, they're becoming these locked-down appliances where the manufacturer maintains control even after you've paid for the device. The frustration in these comments is palpable. One user put it perfectly. They're watching Android slowly morph into iOS, except without the polish and integration that at least makes Apple's walled gardens somewhat bearable. And that's the thing. Android's whole selling point was supposed to be openness and flexibility. That's why people chose it over iPhone in the first place.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The community isn't just complaining, they're strategizing. There's this whole underground railroad of alternatives being discussed. Graphene OS, Lineage OS, F-Droid. People are sharing detailed guides on how to escape Google's grip while still using Android hardware. Some folks are even talking about going full nuclear, ditching smartphones entirely for a combination of dumb phones and tablets, or separate devices for different purposes. One commenter made this really thought-provoking point about how we've essentially accepted a rental model for our devices without realizing it. You buy the hardware, sure, but the software? That's increasingly feeling like it's on loan from Google, with terms that can change whenever they feel like it. And the kicker is, most people won't even notice or care until it affects something they specifically want to do. There was this one contrarian view that caught my attention, though. Someone argued that technically, Google only licenses you the software, so if you don't like their rules, you're free to install an open-source OS. Which, okay, technically true, but come on. That's like saying if you don't like your car's emissions system, you're free to build your own engine from scratch. The technical possibility doesn't make it practical for 99% of users. What really resonates is how this fits into a broader pattern we're seeing across tech. Everything's becoming a service, everything needs permission, everything phones home. Your TV needs internet to show you ads, your car has features locked behind subscriptions, and now your phone needs Daddy Google's blessing to install software. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts for the idea of actually owning the things you buy. The PWA discussion was particularly interesting too. Progressive web apps as a potential escape hatch, but even those are under threat. Apple's already limiting them on iOS, and if Google follows suit on Android, that door closes too. It's like watching all the exits slowly being bricked up while we're still inside the building. You know what's wild? Some people in the thread are literally planning their exit strategies from the smartphone ecosystem entirely. Like, these are tech-savvy folks on Hacker News, and they're ready to go back to feature phones rather than deal with this trajectory. When your core audience is talking about abandoning ship, that's something. The most depressing take I saw was someone pointing out that we had this brief, beautiful moment in computing history where devices were both powerful and open, and we're watching it slip away in real time. And the worst part, most people won't even realize what they've lost until it's completely gone. They'll just accept that this is how phones work now. The same way people accepted that you need a Facebook account to message friends or that you can't repair your own devices. This isn't just about side-loading apps anymore. It's about whether we're heading toward a future where every device is essentially a kiosk that its manufacturer controls, where general-purpose computing becomes a specialty item for developers and researchers, rather than something everyone has in their pocket. And judging by these 489 comments, a lot of people are starting to realize they don't like where this train is heading. You know, all this talk about control and fighting against systems that work against us, it brings us to our next story, which is deeply personal for a lot of folks in tech, because sometimes the system you're fighting isn't a corporation, it's your own brain. All right, so now we're diving into something really personal and important. Notes on managing ADHD. And wow, this one struck a chord with the Hacker News community, pulling in almost 400 points and nearly 200 comments. You know what's fascinating here is how this author just cuts through all the noise and shame around ADHD medication with this incredibly direct approach they call chemistry first. And honestly, the response from the community tells you everything about how needed this conversation is. The author basically says, look, your brain has a biological condition. Treat it like one. They use this brilliant metaphor of being a saltwater automaton. We're literally just molecules in salt water, right? So why feel shame about adding the molecules you need to function? It's like if you had diabetes, you wouldn't try willpower your way through insulin production. What really grabbed me was how the author describes their experience before and after medication. They're saying all those productivity tricks we hear about, Pomodoro timers, to-do lists, time blocking, they tried them all, and they just didn't work. Not because they were doing them wrong, but because their brain literally couldn't engage with these tools properly without the right chemistry first. Once they got on stimulants, though, suddenly all these strategies became actually usable. The discussion thread is where this gets even more interesting. Person after person is sharing this same revelation. Oh my God, yes, this is exactly what happened to me. One commenter described how they could finally use to-do lists after medication, but before that, they'd make the list and then their brain would just refuse to look at it, like it didn't exist. Another person talked about creating 17 different productivity systems over the years, none of which stuck until they addressed the underlying ADHD. But here's where it gets spicy. There's this one commenter who really went after the article, basically saying the author is misusing terms like OCD and suggesting maybe they just have attention issues from too much social media. They're advocating for abstinence and structure instead of medication. And you know what? The community pretty firmly pushed back on that, with people sharing how that exact attitude, that ADHD is just a discipline problem, kept them from getting help for years or even decades. The practical stuff people are sharing is gold, though. Someone described this visual system where tasks change color based on how long they've been pending, green to yellow to red, because apparently ADHD brains respond better to visual urgency than abstract deadlines. Another person keeps multiple to-do lists across different media, phone, paper, computer, because their ADHD brain will randomly decide one format is contaminated and unusable for a while.
You know what's powerful about this whole discussion? It's the relief you can feel in these comments. People saying things like, I wish I'd read this 20 years ago, or this would have saved me so much suffering. There's this sense of validation, I guess. that their struggles weren't moral failings or laziness, but an actual medical condition that deserves actual medical treatment. And that chemistry first framing, it's such a simple concept, but apparently revolutionary for many people. The idea that you can't bootstrap your way out of a neurotransmitter problem, that there's no virtue in suffering unnecessarily when medication exists that can help. The author literally says there is no virtue in trying to beat it through willpower alone. And judging by the response, that message really needed to be heard. Speaking of systems that balance themselves, sometimes the most profound insights come from the simplest demonstrations. Our next story is about a visualization that's got people absolutely mesmerized, and it's teaching us something about struggle, balance, and maybe life itself. Okay, so here's something completely different that caught fire on Hacker News yesterday. Eternal struggle is what they're calling it. And honestly, when I first clicked on this, I had no idea what I was getting into. Turns out it's this mesmerizing yin-yang visualization that's got the community absolutely hooked. We're talking 365 points and 90 comments of people just playing with bouncing balls. But hear me out, because this is way cooler than it sounds. So picture this. You've got the classic yin-yang symbol, right? Black and white, that flowing S curve dividing them. Now imagine two balls, one in each section, bouncing around like they're in a pinball machine. But here's the kicker. Every time a ball hits the boundary between black and white, it actually pushes that boundary. The white ball expands the white territory, the black ball expands the black territory, and they're locked in this endless battle for dominance. What's absolutely fascinating is how this system self-balances. Multiple users in the comments discovered this beautiful emergent behavior where, well, let's say the black side starts winning, taking over more space. Suddenly, the black ball has this huge area to bounce around in, so it hits the boundary less frequently. Meanwhile, the white ball is cramped in this tiny space, frantically bouncing off walls and pushing back constantly. The underdog literally fights harder because it has nowhere else to go. It's like accidentally perfect game design that nobody explicitly programmed.
The Hacker News crowd, being who they are, immediately started hacking it. One user figured out you can hit the tilde key to bring up speed controls. Suddenly, you're watching this thing at 10x speed, and it becomes this frantic war. Others dove into the browser console, typing commands like set speed 100 to push it even further. Someone discovered that at extreme speeds, the balls start glitching through boundaries, creating these wild horseshoe patterns, or sometimes one color just completely takes over. There's this great comment thread where someone points out a conceptual issue that's been bugging them. They're saying, wait, shouldn't each ball be pulling its own color inward rather than pushing the other color out? Like the white ball is technically expanding black territory when it pushes. And you know what? They've got a point. It does feel backwards when you think about it that way. The technical discussions got pretty deep too. One developer suggested the physics could be improved with better time-based position supersampling, basically making the collision detection more accurate so the balls can actually push all the way to the edges. Right now, they leave these little gaps, which apparently bothers some people more than others. What really strikes me about this whole thing is it's just two circles bouncing around, but people spent hours watching it, tweaking it, forking the code, creating their own versions. Someone even mentioned they want to see a version with more than two balls, like a three-way struggle with RGB colors. The philosophical types in the comments are having a field day with the metaphors here. Balance, struggle, the fact that dominance creates the seeds of its own downfall. It's one of those beautiful accidents of code where a simple physics simulation accidentally demonstrates something profound about systems and equilibrium. And honestly, I've had it open in a browser tab for the last 20 minutes while prepping this segment, and I can't stop watching it either. There's something hypnotic about seeing that boundary writhe and reshape itself, never quite settling, always in motion. You know, watching those balls bounce around, feeling that pull to keep watching, it brings us to our final story, which asks a fundamental question about how we create technology. Should we trust what we feel or stick to what we can measure? Story 5. You have to feel it.
All right, switching gears here to something that really struck a chord with the Hacker News crowd. We're talking about You Have to Feel It, a piece by Mitchell Hashimoto that's got over 350 points and sparked quite the philosophical debate about how we build technology. So Mitchell's making this provocative argument that, look, we've all been there, right? You're in a meeting, everyone's checking boxes, the requirements are met, the demo works perfectly, ship it. But then users actually get their hands on it and it's just, it works, sure, but it doesn't spark joy. It doesn't feel right. And Mitchell's saying this isn't some nice-to-have polish you add at the end. This feeling, this emotional resonance, it's actually the core of the work itself. What's fascinating is he's basically calling out the entire way most tech companies operate. You know how it goes. Everything's about metrics, KPIs, measurable outcomes. Can you quantify user delight in a spreadsheet? Can you put makes people smile in your quarterly objectives? And yet, Mitchell's arguing that's exactly what separates the products we tolerate from the ones we love. He talks about how every single interaction with technology triggers an emotion. Could be frustration when something's clunky, could be that little hit of satisfaction when something just works perfectly. These feelings, they become part of people's daily lives, part of their routine, their work, their play. The Hacker News discussion on this is where it gets really interesting, though. You've got this fundamental tension playing out between folks who totally get what Mitchell's saying and others who think it's, well, kind of privileged or unrealistic. One commenter made this great point that despite all our talk about being rational, data-driven decision makers, most business decisions, hell, most life decisions actually come down to feelings and vibes anyway. We just dressed them up in spreadsheets afterwards to justify them. But then you've got the counter-arguments too, and they're pretty compelling too. There's this neurodivergent commenter who says, look, I don't feel passion during the work. I feel relief when it's done, and that's okay. They're pushing back on this idea that you need to be emotionally invested, that you need to feel it in your bones to do good work. Some folks are saying the best work, the most growth, actually happens when you're pushing through without feeling it, when you're in the trenches, when it's hard, when you definitely don't want to be there, but you show up anyway. And then there's the corporate reality check. Multiple people pointing out that modern tech companies have become, and I'm quoting here, soulless machines that just don't have room for this kind of emotional connection to the work. You try telling your manager that the feature doesn't feel right and see how far that gets you in your performance review, right? There's this whole discussion about whether you should love your work enough to tinker with it on weekends. Some saying that's where real innovation comes from. Others saying that's just normalizing exploitation. What really resonates with me is this idea that we've created this massive disconnect in how we measure success in tech. The things that get you promoted, that look good on your resume, that impress investors, they're often completely orthogonal to the things that actually make users happy. You can ship on time, under budget, with 0 bugs, and still create something nobody wants to use. Meanwhile, someone else breaks all the rules, misses deadlines, but creates something that just feels right, and it changes everything. It's making me think about all those products we use every day. You know, the ones that just feel good, where every interaction feels considered, intentional, almost like the product knows what you're thinking. That's not accident. That's not luck. That's someone, probably multiple someones, who didn't just build to spec, but actually sat with the product, used it, lived with it, felt where it was awkward or delightful or surprising. The thing is, both sides have a point here. Yes, in an ideal world, we'd all be craftspeople, taking the time to feel our work, to polish every interaction until it sings. But also, yes, sometimes you need to ship. Sometimes good enough is good enough, and not everyone has the luxury of waiting for inspiration or the perfect feeling. Maybe the real insight is knowing when each approach is appropriate, when to push through with discipline, and when to step back and ask, but how does this actually feel? And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. Looking at these 5 stories together, there's this thread running through all of them about control, balance, and the tension between systems and humanity. We started with World War II codebreakers who had to balance perfect communication with perfect security. Then we saw how Google's tightening control over Android is pushing people to question who really owns their devices. We heard from folks managing ADHD who are finding that balance between chemistry and willpower. We watched literal balls fighting for balance in that mesmerizing yin-yang visualization. And we ended with this fundamental question about whether building great technology requires feeling or just following the process. Out of 29 stories that hit Hacker News yesterday, these 5 sparked the most discussion, the most debate, the most passion. And I think that tells us something about what's on the collective mind of the tech community right now. We're all trying to figure out how to maintain our humanity, our agency, our creativity in systems that increasingly want to box us in, measure us, control us. Thanks for joining me today. If you found these stories as thought-provoking as the Hacker News community did, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, whether you're breaking codes, writing code, or just trying to navigate this wild world of technology, sometimes the most important thing isn't what you can measure, it's what you feel. Until tomorrow, keep questioning, keep tinkering, and keep that healthy skepticism alive. This has been your Hacker News Daily. Take care.